Welcome to Willow Creek. And watch your back. When my family moved Grandpa into the Willow Creek retirement community, we thought we were giving him peace, not a battlefield. We had no idea that within just 2 weeks, he'd end up in the hospital, arm broken, dignity bruised, and that we'd be forced to unleash something that hadn't been touched in decades. Grandpa's former identity, his FBI credentials, and a whole lot of trouble for a certain fake HOA, but let me back. My name is Jordan and I work remote in cybersecurity. I live with my younger sister Mara and our dog Toby, but ever since Grandma passed away last fall, we decided it was time Grandpa stopped living alone. He was slowing down, sure, but he wasn't helpless. He just needed some care. Someone to remind him to take his meds, someone to keep the coffee pot from boiling dry at 3 a.m., and someone to keep an eye on his back when he watered the plants barefoot in winter, so when Willow Creek Retirement Community popped up as an option, everything looked perfect on paper. It was quiet, clean, and well-maintained. The brochures were filled with images of smiling neighbors, manicured lawns, shuffleboard tournaments, and friendly staff who genuinely care for your loved ones. There was even a security booth at the gate with a round-the-clock guard and cameras on every corner. To us, it looked like heaven. But what we didn't know was that Willow Creek had its own kind of hell, one disguised in smiles, polite golf claps, and paper-thin authority. On the first day, we were greeted by a sharply dressed woman in her late 50s named Belinda. She introduced herself as the president of the Homeowners Association, although we hadn't seen any mention of a formal HOA in the lease agreement or website. Still, we assumed she was just an overzealous volunteer trying to keep the place neat. She brought over a basket of welcome treats, stale cookies wrapped in saran wrap and a bottle of store-brand sparkling cider. But alongside the sweets was a thick packet titled Community Guidelines, Enforcement Edition. Enforcement for a retirement community? We just like to make sure everyone is safe and peaceful here, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Everything's clearly laid out in the handbook. Curfews, decorations, porch furniture, visitor schedules, and noise levels. Grandpa gave her a look that could curdle milk. He'd fought in 2 wars, buried a wife of 57 years, and once chased down a gang member half his age who tried to snatch a purse on a subway, a laminated. Rulebook wasn't about to faze him. I'll be fine as long as no one tries to tell me when I can use my porch, he said, casually tossing the packet onto the kitchen table. Belinda's eyes narrowed slightly, but she forced another tight smile and left. We thought that was the end of it. We were wrong. The first 2 weeks were fine. Mostly, Grandpa. Settled in, made some new friends, especially a man named Ronnie who used to be a Navy mechanic, and even started gardening again in the small patch behind his unit. But the peace didn't last. It started with notes, sticky ones on his front door, on his car windshield, and even one placed directly on his flower pots. Things like, your porch chairs do not comply with aesthetic guidelines. Watering after 7 p.m. violates quiet hours due to hose noise. Your guest, me, parked too close to the white line. Every note was signed WCHOA Enforcement. Committee, which struck me as odd. Who exactly made up this committee? Was this even legal? More importantly, was this real? The official Willow Creek documents had no mention of a legally registered HOA. That's when I started digging. A search through the county records showed no official HOA filings for Willow Creek, no board of directors, no tax ID, nothing. Even the name WCHOA didn't match any registered nonprofit or organization. That's when the first confrontation happened. Grandpa had just finished trimming his rose bushes one morning and was heading back inside when 2 men in polo shirts and khakis walked up. His driveway, both wore lanyards with plastic ID cards that looked like they were printed at home. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered with sunglasses he didn't take off, pointed at the bushes. You've exceeded the community landscaping. Boundary by 8 inches, he said coldly. Grandpa raised an eyebrow. Says who? The Willow Creek Homeowners Association, the second one said. shorter and red-faced, like he had something to prove. "Those roses are a tripping hazard." "A hazard for who? A marching band?" Grandpa asked, leaning on his cane. "This is private property," the tall one snapped, stepping forward. "We can issue a citation and remove the plants ourselves if you don't comply." Grandpa didn't flinch. "I don't take orders from strangers without a badge or a warrant." That was apparently the wrong thing to say. The tall man moved fast, grabbing Grandpa's arm and twisting it behind his back. Grandpa resisted, stumbled, and went down hard. Landing on the concrete with a sickening crack, he screamed not from fear, from fury. I was pulling into the driveway just as it happened. I slammed the car in park and ran over, shouting at them to back off. But they were already backing away. The short one looked nervous now. They both got into a silver SUV with no license plates and drove off. Grandpa was pale but conscious, clutching his arm. We got him to the hospital where they confirmed what we feared. A fractured humerus, not life-threatening but serious. The doctor also noted bruising around the shoulder and upper back, consistent with assault. He asked if we were pressing charges. I looked at Grandpa, expecting a stubborn no, but he surprised me. "It's time," he said quietly. What happened next felt like something out of a spy movie. Back home, while Mara helped settle Grandpa in, I watched him shuffle into the bedroom, dig around the back of his closet, and return with an old lockbox. Inside was a dusty leather wallet, cracked with age. Inside that wallet, a badge. An FBI badge, real, government-issued, metal and cold to the touch. Alongside it was a federal ID with his photo from decades ago, a number and a laminated clearance level I didn't recognize. "I served for 32 years, he said, voice hard. "Worked undercover for half of them. Mostly organized crime. Fake contractors, union scams, property fraud rings." I blinked. "You were undercover in HOAs?" He gave a dry chuckle. "Kid, HOA scams are a gold mine for certain kinds of predators. Power-hungry grifters posing as enforcers to squeeze money and control out of scared residents." "And these guys?" I asked, thinking about the silver SUV. "They're amateurs, but dangerous," he said. "I'll make some calls." And just like that, my 82-year-old grandpa became the center of a multi-agency investigation. The next few days were a whirlwind. Plainclothes agents began making appearances around the community, posing as visiting relatives, plumbers, even a food delivery guy. We were asked to stay calm, keep Grandpa's badge under wraps, and let them observe. But the fake HOA wasn't done yet. 2 nights later, someone threw a rock through Grandpa's window, a note attached, "Keep quiet or next time it's worse, WC HOA." This wasn't just a power trip. It was a racket. These men weren't enforcing rules. They were extorting fear, and we were about to bring them down. By the time Grandpa had his sling fitted and the painkillers started kicking in, I could already see his mind working like an engine restarting after years of dormancy. He had gone from wounded veteran to calculated tactician in less than 24 hours. I suppose you don't work undercover for over 3 decades without building a personal toolbox of instincts, strategies, and a permanent mental file for bad actors. And right now, every mental alarm he had was going off, loud and clear. The fake HOA wasn't just bluffing. They were running a well-oiled scam that probably spanned years and dozens of victims, and Grandpa had every intention of tearing them down piece by piece. He spent the first day post-hospital quietly observing. Even as I stayed glued to my laptop helping the agents build dossiers, at least 5 different residents, all elderly and all living alone, had experienced similar encounters to what Grandpa endured, but none as violent. Some had been fined for imaginary violations, like non-regulation patio furniture, or excessive birdseed on the lawn. One woman, 84 years old and nearly blind, was told she'd violated curtain transparency ordinances. Whatever that meant, she paid the fine, not knowing she'd just given a fake committee $300 cash in an envelope with no receipt. We finally got confirmation from one of the embedded agents that none of these supposed violations had any basis in law or policy. Worse, several citations were delivered by men matching the description of the two who attacked Grandpa. Khaki pants, sunglasses, fake lanyards, smooth talk, and intimidation tactics tailored to their victims' vulnerabilities. It was a classic racket disguised in bureaucracy, and they had picked the wrong retiree to mess with. That night, Grandpa asked me to gather everyone we knew at Willow Creek who'd been threatened, extorted, or even mildly harassed by the so-called HOA. We called it a community gathering under the pretense of discussing garden upgrades. But in truth, it was the first strategic meeting of what Grandpa called Operation Porchlight, a coordinated takedown effort to expose, record, and trap the imposters. I didn't ask where he got the name, but it stuck. About 14 residents showed up, some with their grown kids, others alone but clutching wrinkled pieces of paper, citations, fines, demand letters, and even one envelope with a fingerprint smudge and no return address. Grandpa, despite his sling and bruised ribs, stood up in front of the group like he was briefing a team of agents. There was something commanding in his presence. Even now, like gravity shifted toward him when he spoke. Everything you've experienced, he began, is not just wrong, it's criminal. These men are not part of any legal HOA. They have no authority, no state registration, and no legitimate connection to Willow Creek's management company. They are impersonators, thieves and cowards. And now, thanks to you and your courage, we're going to catch them. I watched eyes widen, some in fear, others in realization. For so long, these people had been afraid to speak up, afraid of retaliation, afraid of being evicted or humiliated. But now, standing in a circle under the soft glow of porch lights and patio lanterns, they began to feel it. The stirrings of something long buried in neighborhoods like this. Unity. Grandpa laid out the plan. Step 1. Collect. Evidence, every encounter, every visit, every note. We needed photos, audio recordings, timestamps, and witnesses. If someone came knocking, the resident would stall, offer tea, ask for clarification, and keep a phone recording. Step 2. Set bait. The agents embedded in the neighborhood would play roles, some as vulnerable. Seniors, others as careless rule breakers. One agent pretended to install unapproved wind chimes, while another started painting their mailbox the wrong shade of blue. It was all bait, waiting for the fake enforcers to bite. Meanwhile, I kept digging on my end. It turns out that the silver SUV wasn't entirely invisible. Even though the plates were missing, traffic cameras caught partial frame grabs. Cross-referencing timestamps with location data helped us identify a vehicle registered under a shell. LLC connected to a property maintenance company, and guess who owned that company? Belinda. The very same woman who dropped off the welcome basket on day 1. Now everything was starting to align. Belinda wasn't just the mouthpiece of the fake HOA, she was the architect. She had created a faux enforcement committee, used printed materials that looked semi-official, and hired muscle to collect fines and punish defiance. It was clever, terrifying, and, with the right move, totally prosecutable. But then, things got worse. One of the agents, posing as a forgetful widower who left out his recycling bins on the wrong day, was approached not by 2 men this time, but by 4. They weren't just issuing citations. They were threatening eviction. The confrontation turned physical when one of them shoved the agent, not knowing he was being recorded via a hidden lapel mic and backed up by a surveillance van across the street. Within 5 minutes, the agent signaled for extraction, and the team moved in. But the fake enforcers vanished before they could be detained. It was a close call, but it gave us something better than arrests. Faces. High-definition camera footage captured 2 of the suspects clearly enough for identification. And one of them matched a known fraudster with prior convictions for impersonating municipal employees. His name was Craig Lutterman, a former code enforcement officer fired for extortion charges in Arizona. He had vanished for years. Now, apparently resurfaced here, wearing khakis and harassing retirees, we handed everything to the federal agents overseeing the case. And they agreed. It was time to take action. But Grandpa wasn't satisfied with just arrests. He wanted exposure. And that meant one thing: confrontation. The plan was dangerous, complicated, and frankly a little insane. But it was the kind of calculated madness that only someone with field experience could pull off. Grandpa volunteered to be the bait. Again, against the advice of the agents, and even me, he insisted. He wanted to be the one to bring the curtain down, so we set the stage. Grandpa pretended to install an illegal antenna, something the fake HOA had flagged before, and sat on his porch in full view, drinking coffee, waiting. It didn't take long. 2 days later, a silver SUV rolled up just past 6:30 p.m. 2 men stepped out. Same khakis, same plastic lanyards, but this time, they brought a clipboard and a demand letter for $200 in fines. "You again?" Grandpa said coolly, not getting up from his chair. "We warned you," the taller one growled. "I think you're going to want to read this," Grandpa replied, handing them a folded letter. They unfolded it, and for a few seconds everything went quiet. Then the tall man's expression changed. From confident to confused to pale, the letter was a cease and desist order signed by the state attorney's office and the FBI field director, along with an embedded chip, a GPS tracker linked to the envelope. Agents had already traced the letter's handling location and were moving in. The two men turned to flee, but it was too late. A black SUV cut off their vehicle, while two unmarked sedans blocked the rear. Within seconds, the street was swarming with plainclothes agents who identified themselves and placed the two men in custody, but the real moment of triumph came 15 minutes later when Belinda, walking her little Pomeranian like it was any other evening, was stopped at the end of the cul-de-sac by two women in suits. One showed a badge, the other carried a search warrant. Within the hour, her home office had been dismantled, her computers seized, and her network of shell companies uncovered like rotten roots under polished soil. That night, as Grandpa and I sat under the stars, porch lights flickering in the breeze, a quiet settled over the neighborhood. But it wasn't the silence of fear or exhaustion. It was relief, the kind that comes after a long siege finally ends. "You didn't have to do this," I told him, handing him his coffee. "I did," he replied, staring into the darkness where the silver SUV used to park. "They picked the wrong neighborhood, and for the first time since we'd moved, Grandpa, in Willow Creek actually felt like the peaceful place it had promised to be." When the sirens faded and the flashlights dimmed, Willow Creek was left in a strange kind of quiet, not the unsettling quiet that had shadowed the neighborhood for months, but a peaceful one. Like a long storm had finally passed and the town was waiting to see what would grow back in its place. Belinda had been taken away in handcuffs that night, her Pomeranian scooped up by animal control, her carefully curated empire of fake rules and fear dismantled in less than an hour. Grandpa had watched it all from his porch like a general surveying the end of a long campaign. No victory dance, no smug smiles, just a nod. Solemn and satisfied, the FBI confirmed what we already suspected. Belinda wasn't acting alone. She had recruited at least 6 others, some former city inspectors with revoked licenses, others freelance scammers who'd been part of shady contractor rings before. They had pieced together this operation over the course of 3 years, quietly moving into the community, planting fear one fake rule at a time. It wasn't just about money. Though they'd pocketed nearly $90,000 in fees from elderly residents, it was about control. They built a miniature dictatorship in the guise of civility, and most of the victims were too polite, too tired, or too alone to question it. In the days following the arrests, agents met with several residents, explaining what would happen next. Some would testify, others would be listed as victims in a sweeping fraud indictment. And all of them would eventually get their money back through a restitution program. But what surprised me most wasn't the legal aftermath. It was the community's emotional shift. For so long, the residents of Willow Creek had kept to themselves, waving politely at mailboxes, exchanging brief hellos while watering lawns. But now they were knocking on each other's doors, checking in, sharing food, laughing about things that had once been terrifying. The fear was gone, and something else had taken root. A collective strength. One of the first things the residents decided to do was create a real neighborhood council, not an HOA, but a volunteer group made up of actual homeowners and renters, fully transparent, legally documented, with rotating leadership and absolutely no enforcement authority. It would serve as a voice for the residents, a point of connection, not a tool for oppression. Grandpa was unanimously nominated as honorary chairman, of course, though he chuckled and declined, opting instead to advise from the porch with a whiskey in hand. But what no one saw coming was what happened with the property management company. They had quietly observed the fallout from the fake HOA scandal and were terrified of being held liable. Legally, they weren't responsible. Belinda's group had no ties to them. But the residents weren't in the mood to give anyone a pass. So, led by a few of the bolder residents, including me, a delegation marched into their office and demanded that they do better security, better vetting, better communication, and a commitment to never allow such impersonators to operate unchecked again. To their credit, the management company responded well. Within weeks, they had upgraded the gate security system, installed real cameras with cloud-based backups, and even launched a resident verification app so no one could claim to be enforcement without digital confirmation. They also began providing regular legal workshops for seniors, educating them on their rights, contracts, and how to spot scams disguised as neighborhood governance. What began as a dark episode became a catalyst for real change, not just in Willow Creek, but across multiple communities owned by the same company. As for Grandpa, healing took time. The fracture had mended well thanks to physical therapy, but the bruising from the attack had lingered, both physically and emotionally. It wasn't just about pain. It was the feeling of being targeted, underestimated, treated like a nuisance in his own home. But over time, I watched the spark come back. He resumed gardening, expanded the flower bed, even added a raised vegetable planter. His friend Ronnie helped him build it, and they could often be found sitting beside it in the afternoons, arguing about tomatoes and trading war stories. But Grandpa wasn't quite done. One morning he called me over and said there was one last thing he wanted to do. He wanted to write letters, not to lawyers or judges, but to every resident in Willow Creek, personalized notes thanking them for standing up, for sharing their stories, for showing courage even when they were afraid. He wrote over 70 letters by hand, each with a wax seal and his old FBI initials at the bottom, and we delivered them door to door over the course of a week. People cried. People hugged him. Some invited us in for tea, and others just nodded with tears in their eyes. What struck me was how powerful a handwritten note could be in a world obsessed with speed and screens. It wasn't just the message. It was the gesture, the time it took, the sincerity. Grandpa didn't want anyone to forget that they mattered, that their voices were valid, that no one should ever feel powerless in their own home. The residents responded by organizing a surprise community dinner in his honor, a potluck in the park with fairy lights, folding chairs, and a cake that said, "To the man who saved Willow Creek." He didn't cry, not visibly, but I saw him pause for a long time as he looked at that cake, his hand resting gently on his sling. And I knew what he was thinking. He wasn't just proud, he was finally at peace. But peace, as we'd learn, was only temporary, because a few weeks later, a new couple moved into one of the empty units. Smart car, city clothes, lots of questions about how the neighborhood handled compliance. I noticed them lingering by the mailboxes a little too long, asking an elderly woman about current rule enforcement. Something felt off. And just like that, the shadow of a new threat crept into the edge of the neighborhood once again. Grandpa noticed, too. He called me one morning, voice sharp, focused. "Get your laptop," he said. "I think we've got another Belinda brewing." You'd think after taking down a fake HOA ring, organizing a neighborhood revival, and watching an entire community finally exhale after months of intimidation, that would be the end of it. A satisfying conclusion to a war no one asked for, but was bravely fought. But sometimes peace is just the intermission between storms, and we didn't even make it a full month before things got strange again. It started quietly, as these things usually do, and it began with the arrival of new neighbors. They moved into Unit 6B, a corner lot just across from Grandpa's. A cozy little house that had been vacant since its previous owner, Mr. Aldridge, passed away in spring. The newcomers introduced themselves as Dominic and Rachel, late 30s, polished, overly pleasant, the kind of people who smiled too hard and listened too little. They drove a clean black hatchback with dealer plates still on, wore city chic, business casual even on the weekends, and asked far too many questions within the first 2 days of moving in. On the surface, they were polite, bringing muffins to the neighbors, waving at people from their porch, asking Grandpa if he needed help moving the hose. But beneath that gloss of friendliness, there was something hollow, rehearsed, off. It wasn't just what they said, it was how they said it, always steering. Conversations toward community rules, resident expectations, and their interest in leadership roles. I overheard Dominic asking Ronnie if there was a formal system for issuing citations, and Rachel mentioned during a chat with Mara that she noticed a lot of homes violating visual uniformity. Whatever that meant, Grandpa picked up on it immediately. I could see the shift in his posture, the way his eyes narrowed just slightly every time they passed by. He wasn't being paranoid. His instincts had been forged in the field, and those instincts were sounding alarms. Still, he remained cordial, nodding when greeted, engaging just enough to not arouse suspicion but never letting his guard down. He called it smiling with your ears open. It was on the 5th day that things truly turned. I had stopped by to bring Grandpa some groceries, and as I stepped onto the porch, I saw a folded piece of paper wedged in his doorframe. No envelope, no signature, just a bold heading in red ink. Friendly Neighborhood. Reminder. It listed a series of concerns, including overgrown vegetation, his roses, unauthorized outdoor fixtures, his new weather vane, and non-compliant trash bin placement. It all felt eerily familiar. Grandpa read it silently, then looked at me with a calm I'd learned to fear. "Same style, different ink," he said. "They're testing the waters." We took the letter inside, scanned it, and compared it with the fake citations issued months ago by the previous imposters. The formatting was different, but the tone was identical, passive-aggressive, self-righteous, and deliberately vague. It wasn't a coincidence. These weren't just nitpicking neighbors. They were planning something. Over the next week, more reminders appeared on other homes, always unsigned, always vague. One resident, Ms. Claire, a retired teacher who'd just joined the community board, found a typed list of neighborhood infractions tucked under her windshield wiper after a walk. Another resident, Mr. Liu, was told by Rachel that his solar lights might violate the community's harmony clause. There was no such clause. Of course, but the average resident didn't know that. It was psychological warfare wrapped in fake concern. That's when we decided it was time to get ahead of it. Grandpa called an emergency meeting of the neighborhood council. Everyone who had dealt with the last fake HOA was invited, and even some newer residents who'd been confused by the sudden uptick in reminders. This time, instead of a backyard gathering, we used the community clubhouse, a beige brick building that had long been underused, but now became the heart of a defensive movement. Grandpa stood at the podium, his presence alone silencing the room. "We've seen this before," he began. "Fear dressed up as structure, manipulation disguised as order. They want to divide us before they take control." He laid out what we knew, the notes, the tone, the specific targeting of residents who had visible personal touches in their homes or had voiced support for the new council. He didn't point fingers yet, not without proof, but it was clear to everyone in the room who the common denominator was. Dominic and Rachel hadn't shown up to the meeting despite being invited, and that silence spoke volumes. The council voted unanimously to establish a formal watch initiative, not for crime, but for misinformation. Residents were encouraged to report any unsigned notices or odd interactions immediately. We also implemented a system where any real community announcements would be signed by 2 board members and distributed, digitally as well. The days of anonymous papers and fear-fueled compliance were over, but Dominic and Rachel didn't back off. Instead, they became more subtle. They began having walks every morning, always with clipboards, whispering between themselves as they strolled past homes, peeking over fences, pretending to be interested in landscaping. A few residents reported feeling watched, monitored. And then the rumors started. Someone anonymously posted in the Willow Creek Community app, a private group used mostly for sharing recipes and dog photos, that the new council was illegitimate, that it had overstepped and was creating chaos. The post was removed within an hour, but not before several screenshots were taken. The language was oddly legalistic, and it mirrored almost exactly the phrases used by Belinda months ago before her takedown. Grandpa's reaction wasn't loud, it was surgical. He started documenting every public interaction Dominic and Rachel had, timestamps, witnesses, even subtle body language cues. He reached out to an old contact, a cyber analyst now working freelance, and asked him to trace the IP address of the community app post. Sure enough, it pinged from a device registered to Rachel's email domain. That was all we needed. At the next council meeting, Grandpa didn't call them out by name. Instead, he presented the pattern, the letters, the behavior, the digital smear campaign, and the trace. He asked for a vote on issuing a formal neighborhood-wide notice, not to accuse, but to affirm that Willow Creek had no HOA, that any unsigned documentation was to be ignored, and that residents were protected by community law and mutual respect. The vote passed unanimously, and the notice was sent to every mailbox, posted at the clubhouse, and shared on every digital platform. That same night, Dominic and Rachel packed a moving van. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't post in the group. They just left, quietly, quickly, like smoke dispersing after a failed magic trick. The next morning, the unit was empty again, a silent reminder that peace isn't something you inherit, it's something you guard. Actively together, Grandpa didn't gloat. He just sat on the porch with his morning coffee, eyes steady on the street, listening to the birds and the rustling trees. When I joined him, he looked at me and said, "The second wave always comes. Softer, but it hits just as hard if you're not ready. That's why we stay sharp, kid. Not scared. Sharp." And for the first time in my adult life, I understood that neighborhood safety wasn't about fences or cameras. It was about people looking out for each other, not because they had to, but because they chose to, because that's what real communities do. A week after Dominic and Rachel vacated Unit 6B, a thick manila envelope arrived at Grandpa's doorstep. No postage, no return address, just a simple gold-embossed emblem pressed into the flap. The unmistakable seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was as out of place on his doormat as a violin at a boxing match. Grandpa didn't open it immediately. He carried it inside slowly, deliberately, like it might bite. He placed it on the dining table, sat across from it, and stared for a long moment. Then, without saying a word, he slid a letter opener beneath the seal and broke the silence. Inside was a letter and a sealed folder marked "Confidential, Eyes Only." The letter was typed, formal, signed by a deputy regional director from the Washington field office. It read like a briefing, but had the warmth of an old friend updating another. It acknowledged Grandpa's previous service, his contributions during the fake HOA takedown in Willow Creek, and more curiously, it stated that his recent monitoring of suspicious activity had raised important red flags in ongoing investigations beyond local jurisdiction. That's when we realized something. Dominic and Rachel weren't just meddling busybodies or local opportunists trying to resurrect HOA-style control. They were part of a pattern, a growing, deliberate tactic being used across the country by covert fraud rings exploiting neighborhood structures to gather personal information, leverage control, and in some cases conduct financial surveillance. For larger criminal entities, our quiet little conflict had touched something far bigger than we ever imagined. The folder included reports of similar incidents from several states: Arizona, Florida, and Oregon, each eerily similar to ours. Fake community officers issuing pseudo-regulations, manipulating property values, intimidating vulnerable residents, collecting data under the guise of compliance. The FBI suspected a network operating under different shells, sometimes as investment scouts, sometimes under bogus neighborhood reform initiatives. But the methods were the same. These weren't isolated Karens with clipboards. They were coordinated. Grandpa's eyes didn't blink the entire time he read. He absorbed every line like it was intelligence off the battlefield. When he reached the end, he looked at me and said, "I'm being reactivated." I blinked. "Is that even allowed?" He chuckled. "No, but they know I won't say no." He wasn't being assigned a badge or carrying a gun again. That part of his life was done. But they were offering him something new. A civilian consultant role in a quiet unit nicknamed Neighborhood Integrity Initiative. His job wouldn't be to go chasing crooks through alleyways, but to train communities, share his knowledge, and serve as a civilian observer for cases where local authorities were being ignored or manipulated. Essentially, he'd be doing what he already did. But with access, authority, and funding, still there was a choice to make. Grandpa could easily say no and enjoy the new piece of Willow Creek. He had his roses, his porch, his people. But as he stared out the window that afternoon, watching a kid ride his bike down the street and a woman water her plants in the yard across the road, I could see the decision settle in his bones. "This neighborhood matters," he said. "But so do the others. And if this is happening in places like ours, we can't pretend the fight ended at our property line." The next week, we prepared, not for another HOA battle, but for a new phase in Grandpa's life. And mine, too. I'd become his unofficial tech liaison during the first conflict, and now, with official channels involved, my skills would be needed more than ever. Grandpa trusted me, not just because I was his granddaughter, but because I had learned to see the world not just with my eyes, but with strategy, instinct, and patience, traits he respected more than any diploma. Our first task was simple in theory, but massive in scope. Identify neighboring communities that had signs of manipulation or confusion around non-existent HOAs. The FBI gave us access to a private reporting network, where homeowners submitted anonymous complaints when they suspected they were being targeted by illegitimate enforcers or shadow leadership councils. We scrolled through hundreds, then thousands of reports, most of them dismissed as civil disputes by local departments who didn't know what they were looking at. One case stood out: a quiet town called Everspring, nestled about 4 hours south of Willow Creek, where a sudden HOA formed 6 months prior with zero documentation but immediate enforcement. Homeowners reported being fined for things like patio chair placement and lawn edging pattern discrepancies. But when anyone asked to see the HOA charter, they were told it was a members-only internal document. Classic move: opaque governance followed by financial punishment. We took a weekend trip to Everspring under the guise of visiting family. Grandpa and I posed as a retired father and tech-savvy daughter looking to move into a slower-paced town. We struck up conversations at diners, hardware stores, even a church picnic, and what we uncovered was shocking. The HOA there was run by two men, David and Leonard, who both claimed to be former city planners but had zero records with the municipal building department. They'd bought an old civic office building and turned it into a fake HOA headquarters, complete with logos, a receptionist, and even branded. Pens, they had documents, impressive ones, fake seals, approval letters from phony councils, everything. But we noticed a pattern. All citations used the same template as those we'd seen in Willow Creek. Even the wording was eerily similar. It was a franchise of fraud, and Everspring was their newest location. Grandpa didn't confront them, not yet. That's not how this version of him worked anymore. He gathered, documented, verified, and sent everything through the FBI's encrypted portal. Within days, the office was raided under a broader investigation into wire fraud and racketeering. Local residents were stunned, grateful, and left wondering how close they came to losing everything to a system that didn't even exist. On the ride back home, Grandpa was quiet, not brooding but thoughtful. "You know," he said, staring out at the long stretch of country road. "I used to think justice was a big hammer, loud and final, but it's not. It's more like pruning shears, quiet, careful, repetitive. You clip the bad parts away, not to destroy the plant, but to let it grow again, stronger." I looked at him, and I swear he looked a decade younger in that moment, back in Willow Creek. News of Grandpa's new gig started spreading. We tried to keep it low-key, but people noticed he was gone more often, that he took calls at odd hours and had meetings at the clubhouse with visitors who wore suits and sunglasses. Someone jokingly referred to him as Agent Grandpa, and the name stuck, even though he rolled his eyes every time he heard it. But it wasn't just about him anymore. The ripple effect was real. Willow Creek residents started mentoring newer communities about standing up to manipulation. The council shared templates online, how to verify an HOA, how to challenge illegal fines, how to legally dissolve fake associations. Word spread, and soon emails began arriving daily. People from all over asking for advice, for help, for guidance. One night, as we were uploading a new educational video for the Neighborhood Integrity Initiative channel, I asked Grandpa if he ever thought his life would turn out like this. Fighting suburban crime syndicates, becoming a quiet legend among American homeowners. He laughed, full, loud, free. "No," he said, "but I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." It was a bright spring morning when the neighborhood council gathered on Grandpa's lawn, not for another emergency meeting or backyard stakeout, but for something far more meaningful. Chairs had been set up, a small podium faced the cul-de-sac, and neighbors filed in one by one, carrying casseroles, coffee, and hand-painted signs that read things like "Agent Grandpa, our guardian," and "The only HOA we trust is him." The air smelled of magnolias and gratitude, and while the atmosphere was festive, there was an undertone of reverence, because everyone knew something was ending, and something bigger was beginning. 3 months earlier, Grandpa had wrapped up his final mission in the Neighborhood Integrity Initiative. It wasn't a dramatic takedown or a midnight raid. Instead, it had been a quiet but crucial operation in a retirement community in Utah where a fake HOA was being used to launder money through property development shell companies. The residents were mostly elderly, unaware they were being used as pawns. Some had already lost parts of their pensions to sudden compliance fees. Grandpa spent weeks there under the radar, gathering evidence, guiding the local sheriff's office, and eventually helping the FBI freeze assets and restore control to the actual community board. But it had taken a toll on him. After decades of service, both official and unofficial, Grandpa had finally admitted he was tired, not bitter, not broken, just finished. And when he came back to Willow Creek after the Utah mission, he didn't bring intel or paperwork. He brought seeds. He said, "If I'm going to spend my final chapter doing anything, I want to grow something that outlives me." That's when the idea of the Legacy Garden was born. The neighbors insisted on funding it themselves. No city grants, no nonprofit involvement, just pure community effort. The same people who once fought over fence heights and mailbox colors now came together to lay brick walkways, install irrigation, and build benches with plaques engraved with lessons Grandpa had shared over the years. Stand your ground, even if it shakes. Kindness is stronger than regulation. The only real authority is earned, not declared. Within weeks, what had once been Grandpa's modest backyard had turned into a beautiful public garden, a living monument to quiet resistance and louder redemption. That morning, as Grandpa stood before the crowd, holding a mug instead of a microphone, he didn't deliver a speech. He shared a story, not of action or espionage, but of a moment when he was 10 years old, sitting on the porch with his own grandfather. "He told me," Grandpa said, voice steady but soft, "that the world doesn't need more loud men with loud titles. It needs guardians, people who stay when others run, who listen when others command, who act when others wait. I didn't know what he meant back then, but now I do." He paused, looked at me, then at the crowd. "Every one of you has become a guardian of this place, not because of me, but because you remembered who you are, and you remembered that no HOA, real or fake, no council or committee, has the right to steal that from you." The crowd rose to its feet, clapping, cheering, some crying, and Grandpa simply bowed his head in thanks. In the days that followed, Grandpa's role shifted again, not back to agent, not quite to recluse, but to storyteller. Schools invited him to speak about civic duty. Local news outlets ran features titled "The Man Who Taught a Town to Resist," and even a documentary crew came out from Los Angeles to film a series called The Real HOA Chronicles. But Grandpa didn't let the attention change him. He still walked to the corner store every morning for coffee, still sat on his porch in the evenings, and still answered emails from people across the country asking, "How do I fight back against the HOA trying to steal my home?" One of those emails would change everything again. It came from a small town in Louisiana, from a woman named Alana. She explained that her husband, a disabled veteran, had been fined nearly $12,000 by their HOA for improper landscaping. Despite the fact that their front yard was low maintenance and eco-approved, the board refused to provide documentation, and when they finally did, it was filled with forged signatures and outdated codes. Worse, Alana said they'd been threatened with eviction. Despite owning their home outright, Grandpa forwarded the message to his old contact in D.C., who confirmed it. The Louisiana town had been flagged multiple times, but was ignored due to low urgency. Something inside Grandpa reignited. He called me that night, and without preamble said, "We're going to Louisiana." I hesitated. "Are you sure?" "You just retired. Again," he chuckled. "Kid, I'll rest when I'm in the ground. Until then, we've got guardians to train." The mission was different this time. It wasn't about infiltration or exposure. It was about training, mentoring, and empowering the locals to push back legally, properly, and publicly. Grandpa and I spent 3 weeks living in a borrowed RV in Alana's driveway. We taught town hall attendees how to file FOIA requests, helped them connect with state housing authorities, and supported them in building their own community-led review board. By the end of the month, the fraudulent HOA was exposed, the documents invalidated, and the board members fined and replaced. The veterans in the town painted a mural of Grandpa on the side of their VFW hall with the words, "Respect is earned, not enforced." That was the last field trip we took. Not because Grandpa couldn't go on, but because he didn't need to. The seed had fully grown, not just in Willow Creek, but across the nation. Dozens of communities followed the model we'd helped build. HOA resistance chapters, legal literacy workshops, neighborhood watch groups trained not in suspicion, but in solidarity, The phrase Agent Grandpa became more than a meme. It became a symbol of hope, of refusal to be bullied, of the quiet power of the ordinary citizen standing their ground. In the final weeks of that spring, Grandpa gave me something, a worn leather notebook filled with handwritten entries, sketches, clippings, and quotes from years of work. "It's yours now," he said. "You saw me through all of it now. It's your turn to teach." I didn't argue. I just hugged him for a long time, longer than words could handle. And then one morning, a year to the day since the first fake HOA officers tried to take his dignity and broke his arm instead, Grandpa passed away peacefully in his sleep. No alarms, no final battle. Just the quiet exhale of a man who had finished his mission. We buried him under the magnolia tree in the Legacy Garden, per his request, and the entire neighborhood showed up, wearing shirts that read, "We don't fear HOAs. We learned from the best." I speak now across the country, at universities, civic summits, town halls, sharing his story, our story, of resilience, justice, and the power of community. And everywhere I go, I end the same way he did, by reminding people that the battle for your neighborhood isn't won by shouting, suing, or hiding. It's won by standing still when the storm comes, by protecting the people around you, and by never giving up your right to say, "This is our home, and no one steals it without a fight." Because in the end, Grandpa didn't just defeat a fake HOA, he built a real legacy. One that no regulation could contain, no fine could erase, and no title could match.